There's a story told within the Edinburgh University scientific community, of which I was once part, about a very senior scientist, attending a scientific conference and going to a reception, an evening reception. They had not booked for the event as was required in the booking form, and when refused entry, used the classic statement, "Do you know who I am?" At which point, the member of staff called the whole room to silence and said, "Does anybody know who this is? Because he can't remember." Now, it's possibly an apocryphal story, but it illustrates the point of the pomposity of human beings sometimes, especially those who have risen to elated statuses within their organisations. But it's a good story to remember. And so today I'm going to look at Luke. We're looking at Luke this morning, the passage from Luke. And a couple of things just to highlight whilst we're thinking about this. This is the fourth time in the book of Luke that there's a controversy with Jesus about the Sabbath, either on the Sabbath or about the Sabbath. In Luke, the Sabbath comes up quite a lot, it's quite key. And the other thing to notice in Luke, so many of the interactions that Jesus has and the conflicts happen in the context of a meal, or around the table, or in relation to a meal. Luke seems to see people being together, eating and having fellowship as a real key place for teaching and hearing the words of Jesus. And the other thing to notice, which slightly passes us by with that first sentence, is on one occasion when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal. I think we should be slightly surprised that Jesus is going to the house of one of the Pharisees to eat a meal. He has clearly been invited. He clearly knows he is going to be being watched, but he goes. That's where he goes, into the house of the Pharisee. It is unexpected, but notice that. Now, in many ways, this text is very simple. Don't blow yourself into elevated status. Don't be fighting for the seat at the top table. It seems fairly clear. At a wedding banquet in those days, there were hierarchies, mainly relating to men in those days, it would have to be said, but even the men had a hierarchy of men. And the seats at one end would actually be that you could recline on, proper chairs that you could recline on. And so the most important men, or the ones that the person who'd invited you thought most important, were there. And then there was a central chair for the most important person. So even in that context, there was all these seating arrangements that said how important you are. Now, this is not novel, and for the Pharisees, this would not be a novel teaching. So there's several texts, but the one that everybody quoted was Proverbs 25. "Do not exalt yourself in the king's presence, and do not claim a place among the great men. It is better for him to say to you, 'Come up here,' than for him to humiliate you before the nobles." So it's not like Jesus was saying anything that would be surprising, but the Pharisees seem to have lost sight of some of these texts in the way that they were behaving. But then when Luke joins that up with the story about who are you going to invite? If you get invited, who are you going to invite back? And this challenge, and you know, especially if you know somebody who's a really good cook, you know, you want to invite them over for dinner and hope you get invited back, don't you? So we've all done it occasionally, or somebody like really important or, you know, exciting, we'll have to get them for dinner. And Jesus is saying, no. Invite those who nobody invites. Invite the poor, the disadvantaged, the slightly smelly, the slightly scruffy, the person who doesn't like anything that you cook and just wants a boiled egg, whatever. Invite the people that you would not naturally invite. So Jesus pulls all of that together. And in doing that, he's turning everything on its head, as Jesus did. He's turning etiquette on its head, especially with that second calling. Because I think the Pharisees would usually be inviting the important people to come to dinner. So stage one is don't fight about who's most important. Stage two is, could you please invite people who are not important for dinner? So, I mean, that actually seems very straightforward, and unusually for Jesus, you know, we could read it and we're sorted. But there is this other little word in there that, again, we read straight past, and it says, he told them a parable. Now, that changes everything. Because if he's telling them a parable, and Luke is saying he's telling them a parable, it's more than telling them about etiquette for dinners. So the superficial reading is etiquette for dinners, but Jesus is doing something else here. He's saying something else. And when we remember that a wedding banquet is used in Revelation, it's the description of what will happen when heaven and earth finally come together. And the Bible tells us that God will come to us, remember, not that we will float up into the ethereal heavenly realm. God will come and be with us, and there will be a banquet, and the banquet of the Lamb. And in Revelation it says, the angel said to me, "Blessed are those who are invited to the wedding supper of the Lamb." So, in talking about this, Jesus is starting to talk about something much bigger, much further ahead. And even in that final verse, which again is easy to miss, "You will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous," is another way of saying at the banquet of the Lamb, at the end of time. So when we read this passage, we know that Jesus is talking about something much more than just sorting out the Pharisees, and Luke is giving something to the church. And bear in mind, when this was being written, at the time it was being written, the churches would exist. We forget that. So when Luke's writing, in his mind, he's thinking about these infant churches and what's going on there. And remember from 1 Corinthians that Paul had to write to the Corinthians about how they dealt with each other at communion. Because the important people were getting in there first and eating everything, and the hungry people were turning up and getting nothing. So Luke's writing in that context as well. There's also this imagery from earlier on in Luke. People will come from the east and the west and the north and the south and will take their places at the feast of the kingdom. So there's quite a lot of scripture that suggests that meals are important, being together, and who's at the meal. Now, the thing that would have been within Luke's mind as well in particular was this idea, which was really, really hard for the Jewish Christians, that the Gentiles, the non-Jews, were coming, being invited, as had been prophesied way back in Genesis. Everybody was being called in, not just those who saw themselves as the family of God. And so this was also going on, and it was very hard for the Jewish Christians to get their heads around people coming in who didn't have that background, and it upset them. And particularly the concept of those people being at the top of the table, being as likely and as much, they could be at the top of the table as well. That idea that there was no hierarchy, that being a Jewish Christian was not better than being a Gentile Christian. Now these terms, in many ways, feel historical, but the same happens in churches today. Because some of us have grown up, we can't think of a time we weren't Christians. We weren't in the church. We know everything. We know when to stand up, sit down. We've read this, and we've memorized this, and da. And in churches today, the same problem can arise, that people come in who know nothing, and who are indirectly or directly made to feel uncomfortable because they don't know this and they don't do that, they've stood up at the wrong time. I remember vividly two young women coming into St. Mungo's once who had clearly just never been to church in their lives, and how uncomfortable they were. And actually I realised how difficult it is to come into church, because once the service starts, you're off, and you can't sort of go, excuse me, can somebody please, So there's still a message in here about the bringing together of people, and then the not jostling for position, and that happens in churches too, wherever it happens. And Tom Wright says that pride is the great cloud that blocks out God's generosity. Pride is a cloud that blocks out God's generosity. And they are a reminder to us, and we've had many reminders of this in the last 6 months, that as a church, we are going to be a church that has as many seats at the table as possible for whoever comes in the door, and we'll sort people out and help them out, but we will be together and bring people in. Now, there is a risk here with this passage, because in my experience, the problem for us as Christians is not that we think too highly of ourselves, mostly. It's not that we're coming up to John and I'm going to John, I'm far more spiritual than you. and in the heavenly realms I'll have a seat higher up, so I'm actually more spiritual. That is not the problem. The problem is usually, I am a worm. I am not worthy. I would actually be quite happy to be in the corner of the room and not have a chair. So long as I am there, I don't really mind. I will be couched. And I don't know if you remember when we were doing the journaling morning and I was using a new liturgy which I hadn't used before. Rule 1, always read it first. And I got to the final part before the communion and it said something like, I don't mind even if I come through the smallest door into heaven and I'm the poorest person. And I didn't read it because that's not how God looks at us. And so my message to us this morning is, I don't think the problem usually is people thinking too highly of themselves. It's that they don't think of themselves as God sees them. They don't see that God, for every single person here, you are the beloved of God. Like, we are the beloved of God. We are the children of God. Who sits and looks at their children without love, even though they might be troublesome or and I didn't mean to be looking at Mike at that moment. You know, we are the beloved of God, and we are equal. We have no right to be at the table. We have no right to be in the banqueting hall, but we have every right because of what God's given to us. And that to me, with this message for us at this time, it's not so much worrying that we think too much of ourselves. It's to remind us that we are all invited to the table together, in spite of our flaws, but called to blossom there. It's funny, I'm reading Genesis at the moment, and I'm so amazed that I haven't noticed this before, but the people that God uses have huge flaws. I mean, the Bible is not fair. If you read the Old Testament, Esau and Jacob I'm doing at the moment, Jacob was terrible. Isaac was pretty terrible. Everybody pretended their wives were their sisters. But God uses us. God has a purpose and uses us, not because we're really good or we're this, but just because God is God and God has a purpose. And if we sit around the table together, that's the place that we'll learn that we are the beloved as well. Now I'm going to finish with it's a very well-known poem. Well, actually, I didn't know it until it's apparently a well-known poem by George Herbert. Now, I'm going to explain, because it's in quite Old English, that when the word love is used, I think what George Herbert is talking about is either God or Jesus. So we're using the word love for God or Jesus. And it's a story of somebody being called to eat at the table of God and their reaction to it, okay? So you're hearing Jesus talking to someone who's being called in to have dinner and is going, okay? So this is the language, but love bade me welcome, but my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, the ungrateful. Ah, my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand, and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And you know not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, said love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. Amen.